Welcome to the LDN radio show, brought to you by the LDN Research Trust. I'm your host, Linda Elsegood. I have an exciting lineup of guest speakers who are LDN experts in their field. We will be discussing low-dose Naltrexone and its many uses in autoimmune diseases, cancers, etc. You're invited to join us on air, asking your questions by calling in on the local rate phone numbers in the UK and the US, which can be found on ldnradio.org. Thank you for joining us. Today's guest will be Dr. Gerard Younger, and he's coming back to join us and talk to us about all the research and his experience of low-dose Naltrexone. Today's show sponsor, Care First Specialty Pharmacy. They are leading compounders of LDN and other custom treatments servicing patients in over 18 states coast to coast. They are widely accredited to provide you with the highest quality demanded by the industry and the expert service you expect. To learn more, call 844-822-7379 or visit cfspharmacy.com. Hello, Gerard, and thank you very much for joining us again today.
Yeah, happy to talk with you.
That's wonderful. So, you're going to take us on a journey. Can you tell us when you first heard about LDN?
Yeah, or we can go even farther back until when I first heard of Naltrexone, because I used it in different contexts before I even heard of LDN. So I don't know if you want to go all the way back there or start with LDN.
No, we'll go all the way back. We have plenty of time. Yeah, sure.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's basically my scientific career. So I'm happy to talk about that. I actually used it as a graduate student. So before I even had my PhD, I was at the University of Tennessee, and at that time, I wasn't even looking at fibromyalgia. I wasn't looking at chronic fatigue syndrome. I was interested in, I was in a program trying to figure out what's the relationship between physiology and psychology. How does chemistry in our body drive who we are? And I was doing different studies, but I was trying to figure out this group called repressive copers. And that's not a phrase that's thrown around that much, but they're people who they don't acknowledge negative stuff around them, so they don't realize when people are mad at them, and so they go through life and they say that everything's great, but even when things aren't great, and so they have really difficult times in relationships because they can't detect when things are bad, and so that's not a good thing. And what's interesting about these repressive copers is they have really high blood pressure, which is kind of strange because if they think everything's good, why is their blood pressure so high? So I think I know what's going on with these people. I think that unconsciously they are detecting things are bad, but they're repressing it, and that's driving up their blood pressure. And when your blood pressure goes up, it activates opioid systems. And so you flood your system with opioids, and that makes you feel good. So they're basically activating their own opioid system. And so I wanted to prove that, so I actually used Naltrexone, and that was the first time I ever tried this drug. I didn't know how it was going to work, but Naltrexone blocks the opioid system. And so I gave these people 50 milligrams of Naltrexone, and then I gave it to healthy people as well, or people who weren't repressive copers and didn't have hypertension. And the results were really pretty fascinating. This is my dissertation study. The healthy people, I'd give them the Naltrexone. Again, this is full dose, not low dose. And they didn't notice anything at all. It was the same as placebo. They didn't feel any different. They're like, I don't know, did you give me something? I can't tell. But these repressive copers had a very significant reaction. They became really anxious. Some of them got into arguments after they left the laboratory, and they all had increases of kind of a malaise and anxious feelings. So what I thought happened is when I blocked their opioid system, I got rid of that coping mechanism they had that they didn't even realize they were activating, And so then all this anxiety that they've been avoiding with their opioids suddenly came up, and so all these people became really anxious. And so I think it's one of the first times that we've ever shown that you can change a physiological system like the opioid system and change a critical part of someone's personality. And so that got me started on Naltrexone, and I realized, wow, this opioid system has a lot more to do than just pain. And now we know, yeah, it's related to the immune system. It's way, way more than what we used to think. So that's how I got started with Naltrexone. I've been using it in a lot of different contexts ever since then.
Mm-hmm.
So
I was going to say, don't stop there. Carry on. This is really interesting.
All right. I'd say what. I'll walk you through the thing, and just let me know if I go into too much detail or too much or too little. But that was my dissertation. So again, that was University of Tennessee. I'm like, all right, this is a drug that's very important. This is doing something significant to people, and the opioid system has a lot more to do than just pain. So I'm going to keep an eye on this. I'm going to keep researching this. So then I went to Arizona State University. This is kind of the second phase of my kind of scientific career. And when I got to ASU, we were trying to figure out different diseases, but one of them was fibromyalgia. And especially at that time, this is 12 plus years ago, we knew basically nothing about fibromyalgia. We knew they were in pain all over. We had no idea what was wrong with them. And so I was trying to figure out fibromyalgia. I kind of took it on. It's like, this is an interesting, not only scientific problem, because I can discover something new, but it's a huge medical problem because there's millions of people suffering from this disorder. So I started by asking around, through the internet and through clinicians. I'm like, what have you tried for fibromyalgia that actually works? And this LDN was coming up, and this is the first I'd heard of it, is when I actually got on the internet and started asking people, well, did anything work? And they're like, yeah, actually the best thing that I've ever took was low-dose Naltrexone. And I had the same response to that probably most clinical researchers have, which is, well, that's weird. Opioids like Naltrexone, opioid antagonists like Naltrexone, they block your opioid system. Why in the world would someone who has a pain disorder ever want to block their opioids? The opioids are what are supposed to be reducing your pain, so you're removing your own pain-reducing mechanisms. It's the opposite of what you'd want to do. Most doctors are giving you opioids to increase that system. So it seemed backwards. And so I was kind of struggling with how in the world could this be working. And so I started talking to people who were doing this work clinically, and they were saying, okay, well, what's happening here is we're giving a low dose, so we're blocking the system temporarily, but that causes the system to compensate by producing more opioids. So we block it transiently at night, and then the next day you're going to have this surge of additional opioids. And I thought, well, that's I guess that is possible, though it wasn't super convincing to me, because that's saying fibromyalgia is an opioid deficiency syndrome. And if that were the case, then giving people opioids should help. If they're deficient, then why not just give them oxycodone or hydrocodone, something like that? But that doesn't work for fibromyalgia. So that explanation didn't sit well with me. So I originally didn't think to use low-dose Naltrexone because the mechanism didn't make sense to me. But I thought, okay, I'll do a study to see if this theory is right. Maybe fibromyalgia the opioid system is dysregulated. So I actually did something where I gave a full dose of Naltrexone. This was at ASU. I was probably second year as a postdoc. I gave a full dose of Naltrexone to fibromyalgia patients. And I saw how that changed their response to pain that we had administered in the laboratory. We did heat pain and mechanical pain, and then I also did healthy controls. So healthy women and women with fibromyalgia, before and after a full dose of Naltrexone. The question is does this affect one group more than the other in a way that suggests fibromyalgia has dysregulated opioid system? And when I finished that study, I couldn't find any differences between the groups. So the Naltrexone affected the fibromyalgia women this is just one administration in full dose, affected the fibromyalgia women the same as it did the healthy women. There was no difference. In fact, there was very little change at all in terms of how they responded to pain. So I published that paper, and I came away saying, I can see no evidence that there's anything wrong with the opioid system of women with fibromyalgia. I don't think that's what the problem is. So that idea that low-dose naltrexone is, blocking the system and then they make more opioids and that's why it helps, I don't think that's what's going on. And so I kind of sat on it for a while because I'm like, well, I know people are saying low-dose naltrexone is working, but until the mechanism makes sense to me, I can't put a lot of my resources and time into it because it's just too risky. So, I was at Arizona State University for 3 years total, finishing up my postdoc and learning different techniques. And right before I went to Stanford, one of my mentors, his name is John Rich, he gave me this paper, and I think I can say it's the most important paper I've ever read in my scientific career. And it was called Glia as the Bad Guys. I don't know if you've ever seen this paper. It was written by Mark Hutchinson and Linda Watkins out of Colorado. Mark Hutchinson is back in Australia now. But it was a paper that was saying that a lot of chronic pain and other chronic diseases is caused by abnormal microglia, which is something that, you and I have talked about many times before, but that was a new idea to me at the time. It's like, whoa, this really fits with fibromyalgia. This would explain why they have the symptoms they do if their microglia are dysregulated. This would make a lot of sense. This explains all their pain, their fatigue, because when the microglia are activated, it causes sickness response, which is exactly what fibromyalgia looks like. And it would also explain why we can never detect anything with blood draws, because this is all happening in the brain. So that was a really impactful paper, and I transferred over to Stanford with this idea in my head that I think fibromyalgia is this abnormal microglia activation, so I need to find a way to test this. And so I got to Stanford, and I was trying to think, all right, how am I going to prove this? We can't get to the microglia because you would kill the person if you do that. So what drug could I give that would help? And I was looking at minocycline and other things like that. And I didn't find anything that was really inspiring me. And then probably the second most important thing happened. So I was at my office, and I get calls all the time. People have ideas, and I love getting those ideas just from people who say, hey, have you ever thought about this? I try to get back to people, but usually there's too many for me to respond to all of them. But I got this call on my voicemail, and it was somebody I didn't know who it was, and he said, I need to talk to you about naltrexone and fibromyalgia. And so I decided to call him back, and he said, I got on the phone with him, his name's Mr. Benz, and he said, I saw that you did something with naltrexone and fibromyalgia, and I said, yeah, but I don't think I'm going to do more with that because this opioid blockade thing doesn't make sense to me. I just can't make it fit. And he said, well, that naltrexone also blocks microglia activation. And I said, no, I did not know that. I had never seen that before. I'd missed that literature. And so I got off the phone with him, and I started looking through literature, not about low-dose naltrexone, but this is basic science literature, and I found a number of papers where, yes, naltrexone blocks microglia response and reduces their activation. So then everything clicked. Now it makes sense to me why a low dose of naltrexone could help fibromyalgia, because if I think fibromyalgia is due to these abnormal activated microglia, and now I've got evidence that naltrexone reduces that microglia activation, and now I'm hearing from people saying that low-dose naltrexone helps with their symptoms, now everything's converging in a way that makes sense. So this was probably 2008 when all this kind of clicked. I went, oh, okay, now I've got it. I think this naltrexone is going to work. Let's do the clinical trial. So the thing is, it took all that stuff coming together, because when you're a postdoctoral fellow, if you if you pursue the wrong idea and you invest all those resources into it, that could be the end of your career, because you've got this short period of time to get something interesting, to get funding that's going to fund your career. So, it took a lot to compel me to go in that direction, but it finally all came together at that point. So, and that's what started the clinical trial. So, I can go into those. Is that pretty clear explanation what got me up to
it really is.
Yeah.
So that piqued your interest, as it were.
Yeah, and it prioritize. There's 100 different things I could have done, and the story could have been me researching a number of other drugs. I could have easily gone another direction. So, it did more than just pique the interest. I mean, it really was compelling enough to make me prioritize that above all the other things I could have been doing, because we only have time to run. Maybe you can run, especially as a postdoc, maybe 3 studies really well in 3 years. So you can't do a lot. So you put it at the very top, and that wouldn't have happened if we didn't have that combination. If we didn't have the basic science that's been done by one type of researcher, if we didn't have those patients online saying, "Hey, this worked," and this kind of clinical stuff as well. So all came together, but no one had done a clinical trial, and so that was an obvious thing to me. It's like, all right, there's enough has come together. Let's do the first clinical trial. Again, at that early stage, you don't want to put in a lot of money and time into something that may not work, and so I was pretty cautious, and we ran that first clinical trial at Stanford probably in 2008. And Mr. Benz, who gave me that idea, actually helped fund that study, which was really critical. That funding did not come from NIH. It came from a private donor, so that's really important. And we were able to get enough money to do the 10-person study, which is the first time it had been tried in fibromyalgia. And I think, I don't know if you want to go through the details of the study, because we actually did quite a few studies after that. But,
I would actually.
The first one...
No, because the first one is where you actually put your career on the line to prove you're right.
Yeah.
So I think we would like to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the most risky one from my perspective at the time, and now it seems pretty easy. But back then, I didn't know what was going to happen, and so there's a lot of guesswork, and especially dosage and things like that. I just had to guess and rely on kind of reports that have been put out by other groups using it clinically. But when I'm sitting there, again, 2008 postdoc, like, okay, I want to do this trial, I want to do it right, but you can't put all your resources into it. You have to make it kind of economical, I guess. So the first study is what happens when you want to do it relatively quick to see what your results are, and you don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on it. You do a pretty small sample size trial, 10 people, and you don't follow them for very long, maybe 10 weeks, and you don't double blind it. It's just single blind. So the patients in the study, who all were women with fibromyalgia, they received placebo first, and for, I think it was 4 weeks, and then low-dose Naltrexone for not even 10 weeks. I knew what they were getting because it's a lot easier to run that type of study. You don't have to keep everything blinded to the investigator, but the patients didn't know what they were getting when. So that's a single-blind study, and that's kind of the lowest level of kind of blind control that you can do, but it's good enough to control for some of that expectation stuff. So we did that, ran the study pretty quickly. I think we got it done in about a year, and the results were really impressive. If people don't know, what I like to do, I don't like the idea of just bringing people to the laboratory every few months and then doing tests. So we always give them either tablets or phones, and I want to see what they're like at home, because that's what really matters. I don't care what they're like in the laboratory. That's such a weird environment anyway. Just coming to a lab can change the way you feel about things. So what are they like in their real environment at home? And so we give them these tablets, handheld computers, and they can track their pain, fatigue, cognition, stress, sleep, and they can do that every day at home, and then we get real-world observations. So it looked good. I mean, basically, in that first study, out of 10 people, 6 of them had a significant response, which would be at least a 30% reduction of their pain, and rating their improvement as good or very good. So 6 out of 10 is pretty rare when it comes to pharmaceuticals. Usually drugs may work for 20% or so of people, so this was kind of shocking. There was a placebo response. I clearly saw a handful of people who had a great response at first, and then that response kind of went away over time, and that suggests someone who maybe just was excited about trying the drug, and it was an expectation transient thing, but that was the minority. The majority had this, if you wanted to look at the paper, it's not a placebo response at all, because it's a very slow reduction of their pain week after week after week, and that's not what placebo effects look like. Placebo effects are very fast, and they happen very early. So we were seeing this improvement of symptoms over a long period of time, and what I didn't realize at the time is that naltrexone, it takes a while to know if it's going to work. I mean, I don't know, clinicians may argue maybe they observe something different, but definitely in our trials, a month is not enough. I mean, at a month, you're just starting to get a clue as to whether or not someone's going to respond. At 2 months, you're getting a much better clue, but it may take 3 months before you fully know if it's really worth them being on it long time. I didn't realize that at the time, so the study was too short, and so I saw the symptoms going down, 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 and then it was the end of the study, because we don't analyze the data until the end. So I'm like, I wonder what would have happened if we would have done this for a longer period of time. Would this have kept going down? I mean, when does it end? I don't know, because we ended the study. So there were a lot of things there were a lot of deficiencies in that first study, but it did what it was supposed to. I mean, the idea for this first study is to say, is there something here? That's the only question. Is this an area that's worth pursuing? And the results were definitely clear enough. They weren't enough for me to say, hey, everyone take this drug, because you can't do that until you run a lot of trials, but it was enough to say, yeah, this is a promising line of research. And so that was the first publication. I think that came out, I think that was 2009. Yeah, I think it was 2009 came out, and got a lot of attention, and it was enough information for me to get larger grants, time for American Fibromyalgia Syndrome Association, to do the second trial. So I can talk about that next, unless there's anything we wanted to discuss about the first one.
No, that's fine. The world really has to thank you for doing that first trial. As I say, putting your career on the line, having the confidence to go with it. It may have been decades before somebody else had decided to do it. So a big thank you for that. It's very brave of you. I'm just pleased it worked out. But we'll just have a quick break, and then we'll come back and hear about your other studies. Okay. The LDN Research Trust has its own forum, which can be found at forum.ldnresearchtrust.org or via our website. The forum is divided into sections, so it's easy to navigate and find what you're looking for. You can share your experience, ask questions, keep a journal, etc. Unlike Facebook, the posts are always easy to find and don't get buried. We have a private medical professionals only section. To find out more, please email me, linda@ldnrt.org. Today's show sponsor, Care First Speciality Pharmacy. They are leading compounders of LDN and other custom treatments servicing patients in over 18 states coast to coast. They are widely accredited to provide you with the highest quality demanded by the industry and the expert service you expect. To learn more, call 844-822-7379 or visit cfspharmacy.com. Welcome back. So, where does the story go now? You've got the funding to do your second trial. How do you go about putting that together?
Sure. So, right, AFSA was good enough to give us the money, which was a direct result of the first study that was published and the results that came out, and that's how it works in the grant world. Is you do the small, then the next step is there's two things you want to do. You have to replicate the first study because, if you ever look in the scientific literature and you see one paper on how this drug worked and there's not a follow-up paper, you can never trust that first study. It has to be replicated because if you just run one study, there could be a fluke. You might have just happened to get the 10 people who were going to respond great and no one else was going to respond to it, or maybe so maybe the population or the sample wasn't representative. Maybe there was just some kind of, they just happened to get better. It sounds unlikely. I know it may sound super unlikely, but there are lots of studies that look great, and then when someone tries to repeat it, they fail miserably. And so as a scientist who wants to put out stuff that's real, the first thing I want to do after I get an incredible and maybe unexpected result is to make sure that it's real by repeating it. And so that's the big idea of the second study. But there's something else that we wanted to do with the second study, and that's to make the study bigger, so more representative of real-world fibromyalgia. And then we also wanted to add a bunch of experimental controls. So I mentioned that the first study was kind of weak on stats, and we did that for practical reasons. But the second study, you got to start putting double blind, and we actually did that triple blind. So that means the patient didn't know what they were getting. None of the investigators knew what the patients were getting when. And when we did the statistics, we were blinded to what the groups were and when people received what. It's placebo-controlled, so it's blinded all the way until the stats are finished, and then right before we write the paper, we uncover what's drug, what's placebo. So that's about as blinded as you can get. So that means there's no bias in how we do the analysis, so we can trust the results more. So we made it larger, we had it placebo-controlled, and we added the extra blinding thing, and we also made it longer. That was the other thing, as I noted. On the first study, it was just too short, and so now we doubled the length. So I get to see what happens over a longer period of time. And so the goal was, or the question was, if we do this again in a larger group, are we going to get the same results, or is it going to be a wash the second time? So ran the study. This was also done at Stanford, and this was probably done about 2011, 2012. So, it took more than a year because this is a bigger study. And AFSA, again, American Fibromyalgia Syndrome Association, helped us to recruit, but, it still takes a while. We targeted 30 women. So this is not a massive study. This is something that probably cost, roughly about $75,000 to do. So not very expensive, but then again, it's not hundreds and hundreds of people like you see these massive pharmaceutical-funded trials. This was 30, so 3 times larger than the first one, but not impressively big. But it's good enough to do the statistics. So the idea was basically the same. I didn't want to change too much. I didn't want to change the dosage because it worked so well the first time. So we stuck with the dose that we've always used, which is 4.5 milligrams. I didn't do, and this is kind of unheard of now, but I didn't do any kind of titration, so I didn't start low. That means some people have some side effects sometimes at the beginning because we don't do that slow titration, but the majority of people did absolutely fine. Again, this is fibromyalgia, but most of them did perfectly fine going straight into 4.5. But I think it would have been better if we would have started at 1 and had a few weeks to increase it, but that's stuff I know now that I didn't know then. But it was okay for the time. So 4.5 milligrams, much longer period of observation. And we did the same thing. I gave them the tablet, handheld computer, had them track their symptoms at home. They took it once a day at night, and their naltrexone phase was 12 weeks. And I also added a follow-up phase at the end of 4 weeks because I wanted to know what happens when you stop taking naltrexone or low-dose naltrexone. Do you stay improved? Do your symptoms go right back to baseline? or does it slowly go back? That gives me information about how fundamental of a mechanism is being affected by this drug. Because, if you're taking a pain reliever like an opioid and it's reducing your pain, that's great. But if you stop taking that opioid, as soon as that drug is washed out of your system, like 24 hours later, your pain's going to be back, maybe even worse than before. And so I wanted to know if something like that's happening with naltrexone. When we finished the study, a number of interesting things came out. So the first and probably most important thing is when we looked at pain reduction, the rate of response was the same as it was in the first study. It was 60%. So it still looks like 6 out of 10 women with fibromyalgia are getting a clinically significant response from low-dose naltrexone. So that's the major finding. That means, if you're a physician and you've got 10 fibromyalgia patients, you don't know what to do with them, you give them all low-dose naltrexone, you should expect that 6 of them are going to get a really good response from that. So that's the most important thing to put out. Some other observations we made with that is the follow-up period, to me, was really fascinating. What happened after they stopped taking the naltrexone? I wasn't sure what was going to happen, but just like the symptoms are reduced very slowly when you're on naltrexone, the symptoms take a while to come back when you stop taking it. So at the end of 12 weeks of naltrexone, they just stopped cold turkey, no more pills, you're done with the study, and then we tracked them for another month. The symptoms did not go back to baseline in that month period. Now, it didn't stay flat. It started to increase, but it was a very slow increase. So that was telling me that naltrexone is not just something that's relieving symptoms, so you have to keep it in your system all the time or else your symptoms come back. It's changing something fundamentally, because that's the only way you would expect to have symptom relief even when the drug is eliminated from your system. And again, naltrexone's gone in 24 or so hours. And so for you to still be better than baseline in a month, something changed fundamentally. And I still think that's changing the way that the microglia respond to stimuli, and that's why it's working. And so I think it's not just covering up symptoms, but we still have to prove that, but that's how I interpret it. So that was kind of the findings. Even at 12 weeks, we still did not see the symptom reduction bottom out. So even 12 weeks is not enough to see what naltrexone is going to do for a person. I don't even know now how much time you need. I still think it's kind of around 3 to 4 months where you're going to maybe see that max effect, but we'd have to do a really long study to see that. So same response rate. Also at that time, I was noticing that the work by Jill Smith, she's at Georgetown now, in Crohn's disease, her response rate is the same. It's 6 out of 10 of her Crohn's disease patients. So I'm like, wow, this is really all coming together. There's got to be something here, because you don't see things repeat this much unless it's legitimate. So that was an exciting time. Anytime, as a researcher, one of the scariest things you can do is try to replicate one of your research studies, because the worst thing that can ever happen to you is your study fails to replicate. Because then what do? Then you have to write a paper saying, that first study we did, that was probably wrong. And, that you can imagine how horrible, because your career is your reputation. So when you get that replication, you're like, wow, all right, great. That worked out. And again, you see a lot of scientists are scared. They just move from one study to the next. They never replicate it because they're scared to do it. And I understand that, but, you got to just take a deep breath and do it. So that was kind of an anxious time going into the results and analyzing it. And, until you see those test statistics and p-values, you don't know what your life's going to be like. But it worked out the same as the first one. And so, I knew it was on the right track then. At the time, I knew it was important. I didn't know exactly why. But the other big thing that came out at that time is now I had 2 studies, and all of them had, for screening, all of them had erythrocyte sedimentation rate measures taken at baseline. And we did that to screen out people with rheumatoid arthritis and some other autoimmune disorders, because erythrocyte sedimentation rate is a marker. It's a very general marker of inflammation. And if it was over 60 millimeters per hour, that suggests that you have an autoimmune disorder. So we actually didn't admit anyone with an ESR over 60. But then I thought, okay, wait, if naltrexone is this novel anti-inflammatory, then maybe those people with the higher ESR would have a better response to it. And so I did that correlation, and that was actually a separate paper. I think it came out in 2014 or so, and that showed exactly that even if your ESR is not super high, it's not in the range that would indicate an autoimmune disorder, you're probably going to respond better to low-dose naltrexone if you have fibromyalgia and your ESR is slightly elevated. So that tells me that naltrexone is probably indeed working through this unique anti-inflammatory effect. It's not like aspirin. It's not like other anti-inflammatories. It's probably reducing central inflammation and a little bit of peripheral inflammation as well. So that was the big takeaway from that. So that would take us to the latest study that we've done with naltrexone.
Before you go into that, can I just ask a question?
Sure.
We have a lot of people who say they've got to go in hospital for surgery and they're going to need opiate painkillers and they're not going to be able to take the LDN, and they're really worried about taking a break. So what you were saying there about the people with fibromyalgia, the pain didn't come back instantly. How long a break would you think somebody could take without getting negative effects from not taking the LDN?
So what we saw, just observing a month, is that at the end of a month of stopping taking low-dose naltrexone, the average participant, and there could be individual variability, it looks like symptoms were about 50% back to baseline values after a month. So 4 weeks, you can expect to maybe lose, I hate to say it sounds scary, but to lose half of your progress. But yeah, I mean, the pain, we were just looking at pain, but pain went back up to baseline about 50%. So it wasn't all the way there, but yeah, it's something to consider.
Yeah, if you were having to come off it for 2 or 3 weeks, you're obviously not going to get 50% of your symptoms back or your pain back.
Right. So again, so for most things, if you're getting opioids, I mean, now in the United States, physicians are really, it's being hammered into them to keep you on opioids for as little time as possible. So if they can only keep you on opioids for a week, that's what they're going to do. If it's only 2 weeks, they're going to do as minimal as possible. And so it wouldn't be typical for someone to have to be off of naltrexone for a month anyway. And so, yeah, if you're talking about 2 weeks, then maybe you're 25% back to baseline. And so that's not as big of a deal. So that's what to expect. Again, it's a gradual thing on average. So, if someone's scared of, hey, I'm going to not take it tomorrow and I'm suddenly going to be in horrible, horrible pain, that is not, at least in fibromyalgia, that does not look like it's the case.
Okay. That's good. Thank you for answering that.
Sure, yeah. So our latest study, this was a funny one. This was right when I'm moving to University of Alabama, Birmingham, which is where I'm now. And Luke Parkitney, who's from Australia, just joined my team at Stanford, and he's moving with me to UAB. And we really, really wanted to run, we were both interested in this big question about low-dose naltrexone, which is, all right, we know that fibromyalgia patients with higher ESR seem to respond better to low-dose naltrexone. But if we measure inflammatory things in the blood, do they actually go down when someone takes naltrexone? No one has done that before, and we haven't even done that. In all these clinical trials, if I had to tell you my biggest regret, it's that I didn't measure inflammatory things in all these patients longitudinally. I would have loved to have seen, what happened to interleukin-6, which is inflammatory, or tumor necrosis factor alpha. I don't know. I didn't track them pretty much because we didn't have the money, but I didn't know how important those things would be. So I had no idea, does inflammation get reduced by naltrexone? So we really quickly ran a study. It was originally going to be 12 weeks because I've determined that 12 weeks is kind of the minimum time you need to really see what's going to happen. But we were moving to UAB on the 1st of July, and we only had basically 8 weeks. So we made it an 8-week study just so we could run it, get the data, and then analyze it when we moved to UAB. So what we did with this one is we recruited, again, fibromyalgia women. That's pretty much what I focused on. And we got 8 women into that study. So this is a small study, but then they took placebo and they took naltrexone, and they had a baseline period in naltrexone. But what's unique about this study is for the first time, we measured their inflammatory chemicals every 3 days. So they came in for a lot of blood draws. They'd come in about twice a week, come into the lab, and we would measure all these inflammatory chemicals that are most associated with kind of chronic pain, inflammation. And some of them have been implicated in fibromyalgia. And so the big question with this is, can we show that when you take low-dose naltrexone, you see this steady drop of the inflammatory chemicals in the blood? And that would very strongly argue for low-dose naltrexone acting as a novel anti-inflammatory. So we did that study very quickly. We didn't even get to analyze the results until we got to UAB. But when we did analyze those results, we found exactly what we thought was going to happen, and that is there is about 20 chemicals in the blood that are reliably reduced while you're on low-dose naltrexone. And what's funny about it or interesting is you can plot this for people, and you can see it just gradually going down with every blood draw. Just keeps going down, down, down. At 8 weeks, it was still going down. I imagine after 8 weeks, they would have kept going down, but we don't know that. So the big analytes, most people probably won't recognize these, but interleukin-6 was the one that was most reduced. Tumor necrosis factor alpha, these are very important drivers of inflammation. And interleukin-1 beta was reduced, and that one's really interesting because it's probably one of the most important cytokines in driving fatigue. So this suggests to me that this may be similar in chronic fatigue syndrome. And there were a number of other ones, but those are probably the 3 most important. So that was the first time that we saw, you give someone naltrexone, you are definitely improving inflammation, and you're improving pain and fatigue and sleep and stress. So these things have got to be related. So that's enough information for me to say I think fibromyalgia is a unique form of inflammation. It's not like rheumatoid arthritis or osteoarthritis or lupus, but it is a form of autoimmune or inflammatory disorder. Low-dose naltrexone helps, and it helps by reducing that inflammation. And so that catches us up to where we're at right now, which is, I can say that based on these small pilot trials, I know if I had fibromyalgia, that's probably what I would try first because the side effect profile is so reasonable and low for most people. It looks convincing. I would expect my inflammation to go down. And that's where we're at. And so I think, we can talk about possible things to do next. But this last paper I mentioned, that was published in 2017. So that came out not very long ago. I mean, that was really just, I think, April of 2017. So we're still doing the work in the area and trying to figure out, okay, now what's the next most important thing to do in order to see that this is actually used clinically.
Mm-hmm. So what are the next steps?
Good question. Yeah, let me look at my board in my office. I got my big board of ideas, and there's looks like about 80 things written there that I want to do. So,
80? Wow.
Yeah, well, it's brainstorming. So, if I do 10% of those, I'm doing well. But again, it comes back to the prioritization. So for low-dose naltrexone, okay, there's lots of directions we can go. Do we do a larger trial on fibromyalgia? So do we try to get money to do a 300-person trial? Because if you really want to convince clinicians to give a drug, most of them wait until they see that really big trial, and I totally respect that. With small trials, you never know for sure how that's going to work in the general population. But so is that the direction we go? If I choose to do that, it's going to take a whole lot of work. And the question is it worth it? Because if I just find the same thing I've already reported, that 60% respond. Well, I already know that. So is it worth me trying to get millions of dollars to do it in fibromyalgia? So that's one direction, and there's pros and cons to that. The other direction is, do I want to try low-dose naltrexone in other diseases? So we are running a chronic fatigue syndrome low-dose naltrexone trial, because I still think those two things are connected, fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. But we have, of course, multiple sclerosis. We've had pilot trials of that, but I've never done an MS trial, and it's time for another really well-designed trial that's probably fairly large, like 60 to 100 people would be good. So that's another direction, is going to different diseases. And I get asked, probably the biggest question, or the most frequent question I get is, I have this disease, do you think low-dose naltrexone would work for that? And I have to answer the same way, which is always disappointing for the people who write to me, but I always have to say, it's possible, but we cannot know until we do a clinical trial specifically for that disorder. So I don't know. And there's a lot of conditions that could benefit. A lot of neurodegenerative conditions. I mean, I'm even thinking of things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, where there's neurodegeneration, but that may be started by neuroinflammation. And if low-dose naltrexone stops that neuroinflammation, you may prevent the neuronal damage that causes the symptoms down the road. And so early treatment for a lot of different disorders is possible. But we can't test them all because it takes too much time and money, so we got to think of which is most important. So those are directions: bigger fibromyalgia, different conditions. The other direction is trying to prove conclusively how low-dose naltrexone works, and that requires some brain imaging. So we're working on some unique brain imaging methods to show inflammation in the brain. So if I had a brain scan where I can scan a person and say, yes, here is inflammation in the brain, and then give them naltrexone and scan them again and say, look, the inflammation is gone, then we're on to something that would convince even skeptical scientists and clinicians. But without that scan, some of them will be reluctant to really adopt low-dose naltrexone. Now, the problem is coming up with that scan is really difficult. It takes a lot of work to do. And so we're trying some MRI methods. We're working on some PET methods to do that, and trying to figure out what's the best, most reliable, and I guess least invasive way of doing it. Because, if you do PET scans, you have to inject a radioactive tracer and things like that. It's not a huge deal, but some people don't want to do that. So that's the other approach. Do we really focus on proving the mechanism of low-dose naltrexone? And the question is, which one of these approaches, if successfully done, which one of these would help patients the most? What's going to really get this in the consciousness of treating clinicians? Is it the larger trial, or is it proving the mechanism? I don't know the answer, so we just try to look at the options, see which way we should go, and then we decide on one, and we follow it out and see what happens.
So what is the cost as a trial versus finding out with scans the mechanism of LDN?
Yeah, so a clinical trial on about 100 people is something that could be done, at cheapest could be done. They're expensive, they really are. I mean, $500,000 US dollars would probably be the minimum to do a really well-controlled, large clinical trial. So somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million is what's required to do a study that would probably take, 2 to 3 years to recruit that many people and to track them. And a lot of that money goes to the salaries. It just takes so much effort so much work to keep all the patients organized, getting the drugs, all that. So that's about what we're looking at for a clinical trial. For the brain imaging, depends on the modality. So MRI, just so people know, MRI basically costs $500 an hour to run. So we kind of do the math, and if we want to run 50 people and scan them twice, you kind of do 50 times 2 times 500, and then you have to pay them some. So it's cheaper to do MRI. The PET stuff, that's going to be more expensive. that's something that's also going to be probably in the $500,000 to $1 million to develop a very conclusive PET scan that we think we can associate with neuroinflammation. But I think PET is going to eventually, this is positron emission tomography, is probably going to get us closer to truly measuring neuroinflammation than MRI does, because MRI, the things it picks up, I don't think you can measure neuroinflammation directly with MRI. We measure brain temperature, which is a proxy, but we don't know how close of a proxy it is. So I'm probably going to go, I'm still doing brain temperature, but ultimately I do want to go to PET, and I want to find a PET scan that can show inflammation. And we're working with a way of tagging peripheral immune cells to see if they break through the blood-brain barrier. And so if we find them in the brain, we know that there's brain inflammation. And so that's the direction we're going. And I hope we get some funding for that. We're working with a couple of groups to try to get that going and do a pilot study and see if there's something there.
That sounds really interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's another big risk. That's my next big risk, because no one's done anything like this to try to tag immune cells and see if they migrate to the brain after a few days. I think it's the nice thing about it is if it works, it'll be a huge advance. To be able to see abnormal infiltration of immune cells in the brain it'll be useful for MS and all kinds of neurodegenerative disorders and neuroinflammatory and rheumatologic disorders. It'll just be really, really important. But, that's one approach, and I want to do multiple things in parallel. So we do need more clinical trials, and the big question with clinical trials is who are these responders? Okay, so 6 out of 10, but who are these 6 out of 10? And who are these other 4 that don't? How do we predict? Why don't they respond? What's different? And I don't know the answer to that fully yet. I imagine that these are 2 different subgroups, and they actually have a different underlying disease. It just looks the same to us, but they're not actually the same. And I'd really like to know, how do we predict who responds to low-dose naltrexone? And that's another direction, but we'd have to run a pretty large clinical trial to try to do that.
Do you think if the 4 people had taken it for a longer period, they might have improved? I'm only saying that because most doctors who I've interviewed think that their patients, the ultimate time is around the 4-month mark before the majority notice something. That was all I was thinking.
So what I will say on that is it could be a question of time, but maybe even more likely it could be a question of dosage. Because, again, we don't modulate dosage. And if there's one thing I hear a lot from clinicians, I think I've mentioned this to you before, it's that they say, there's some people that 4.5 doesn't work, but 3 works well for them for some reason. Or even more common, 4.5 didn't work, but for this person, when we moved them to 6 milligrams a day, they really responded. And, I have a couple of rheumatologists who tell me that all the time, that if 4.5 doesn't work, they go to 6 or 7.5 or at the very max maybe 9 milligrams a day. And they are telling me for sure that they have patients who respond at the higher dosages but not at the lower. So that suggests another future line, which is instead of doing a huge clinical trial at 4.5 milligrams, do we do a trial where we modulate the dose and test maybe 3 different dosages, or run someone for a few months at a dose and then increase it and see what happens? I'm really interested in doing that too. So, yeah, those 4 people, maybe a couple of them, it just wasn't the right dosage for them. I don't know about the time because they looked pretty flat to me. I mean, it didn't look like a slow decline. It looked like they just weren't responding. But you don't know. Maybe after 2 months they would have started dropping. So that's possible, and we didn't modulate any of those things. So just have to do more studies to test those questions.
I was going to say, the more that you do, the more questions there are to answer, aren't there?
Yeah, sure. And then at the end of the day, and part of the things I have to consider is the clinicians are already doing these experiments in their offices because they have flexibility that I don't. Like any clinician can say, 4.5 didn't work, let's try 6. And so a lot of them who are really on top of this are reading, they're talking to other clinicians, they go to the conferences, they hear a presentation on dosage modulation, and they try it. And so I don't have to test everything scientifically. I just need to do enough foundation, enough groundwork, and then at some point clinicians have to take over and they have to come up with the perfect dosing regimen or the perfect, do you give it once a day or twice a day or 3 times a day? All these things would take me 20 years to do in a purely scientific controlled fashion, but as long as clinicians are using it, they can come up with the best methods. And then maybe after a few years, we can test a couple different methods and say conclusively this is better than this other one, but that's kind of how it's supposed to work. So I'm okay with clinicians taking like what we've done scientifically and then extending it because they can do it so much faster than we can.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, I'm really still pushing to get you working on an MS trial. That would be amazing. And I'm sure all the, as you were saying, all the other different tests and trials that you are doing, like inflammation and things, work across the board for most autoimmune conditions. So it's a win-win, however you look at it, isn't it? So it's been absolutely amazing listening to your experience and your story and your journey. And as I say, you were very brave to tackle it in the first place, and you continue to be brave. So that's amazing. And we look forward to seeing you in September and hearing your talk at the conference.
I will see you then. I'm looking forward to it.
Good. And then maybe you might have looked at those 80 suggestions on your board and tell us what your plan is.
I'll probably do an update at the conference, so there'll be a lot of my science in that talk for sure. Good.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your experience. We've enjoyed listening to you today. Thank you.
Very welcome. Thanks. Bye.
To listen to individual radio shows and interviews, go to www.mixcloud.com/LDNRT. I'll repeat that. It's www.mixcloud.com/LDNRT. Today's show sponsor, Care First Speciality Pharmacy. They are leading compounders of LDN and other custom treatments servicing patients in over 18 states coast to coast. They are widely accredited to provide you with the highest quality demanded by the industry and the expert service you expect. To learn more, call 844-822-7379 or visit cfspharmacy.com. The LDN Health Tracker app, called My LDN, is available free for Androids, iPhones, Macs, PCs, iPads and notebooks. The app allows you to keep track of all your medications, pain levels, sleep, quality of life, etc. You can print out graphs and charts to take to your doctor. Full details on the LDN Research Trust website. You can keep a journal so you won't ever forget anything again and set alarms. The app is free and all your information is held securely and anonymously. By using the app, you'll be taking part in the world's largest LDN survey anonymously. Any questions, please email me, linda@ldnrt.org. Any questions or comments you may have, please email me, Linda, Linda, @ldnrt.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciated your company. Until next time, stay safe and keep well.